and in May 1926 departs for New York to publish her findings.
I think the fascination of the book was its focus on sex, idealized sex, and America was at a stage where it was becoming sex-obsessed, and she catered really to that. Listen to this passage. Familiarity with sex and the recognition of a need of a technique to deal with sex as an art have produced a scheme of personal relations in which there are no neurotic pictures, no frigidity, no impotence except as a temporary result of severe illness. And the capacity for intercourse only once in a night is counted as senility. I mean, who could possibly have fallen for that stuff?
Mead's conclusion that adolescent behaviour is culturally determined is big news for anthropology and very much what Boas wants to hear. The book becomes a triumph for his ideas and the American belief in human perfectibility. The enormous success of the book immediately thrusts Mead into prominence in American intellectual life, a position she will occupy for the next half-century. Although she never again studies Samoa or revises her work, the die is cast. Before arriving in Samoa in 1940, Derek Freeman has already established a reputation as a radical among his fellow university students.
When I was a student at Victoria University College in Wellington, New Zealand, I worked in the seminar of Ernst Spiegelhol, who was a personal friend of Margaret Mead's, and he introduced me to anthropology and to Margaret Mead's work, and in particular taught us that this book, which was then already well known, was of great anthropological significance. Samoa was then an isolated place. It took 13 days by ship from New Zealand to get there, and very few Samoans had been out of the islands. I had a horse and I used to ride over the mountains on the island to this remote village where I worked, and every available moment was spent studying the Samoans. During my first 2 years in Samoa, while I was learning the language, my base was in a village called Sa'anapu, and I stayed there with the family of the senior talking chief in this village. One morning, quite unexpectedly, all of the chiefs of the village assembled and said that they were going to give me a title, an important title of the village. This title is Longona Itanga, which literally means heard at the tree felling, and it is the title of the heir apparent of the high chief of the village. At that time, I was quite young too, I was only 24. They bestowed that title. It took up all of my supplies, which I had to give to them, supplies for a 3-month stay. But from that time on, because I held this title, I was given recognition throughout the village, and I had the right to sit in the Council of Chiefs, which I promptly did, and to attend all of their courts. And it was then that the information that was being brought unmistakably before me that I began to realize that many of the things that Margaret Mead had reported in coming of age in Samoa certainly did not accord with what I was witnessing in Sa'anapu.
In 1943, Derek Freeman leaves Samoa to join the Navy. Later in the 1940s, he studies the Iban, a head-hunting people of central Borneo. He then becomes a professorial fellow at the Australian National University, and it is not until 1965 that he returns to Samoa for 2 years to continue his research. During the 1930s and over the next 40 years, Margaret Mead's reputation continues to grow. She becomes the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and awards. At some point in the 1960s, The world thrusts on Mead's shoulders what is described as a mantle of omniscience, which she accepts as her due and wears with a flourish. It goes well with her forked staff and cape, and adds to her mystique as a superwoman who knows everything, and who also, knowledge being power, can do anything. She becomes indisputably the most publicly celebrated scientist in America, and one of the most revered women of all time.
I knew Margaret very well for, I think, a period of 23 years. I, of course, did field work with her for several years in Manus, in New Guinea. And I was also part of her small group that she referred to as her family. Now, one thing Margaret was, she was an excellent lecturer, a fantastic entertainer and speaker. She really was an enchantress, and she could really cast a spell. She never failed to mesmerize me. Even after many years I knew her, I would sit in the audience and I'd watch her absolutely spellbound and wondered, how do you become like that? Absolutely incredibly gifted in this way. And I think that's what, I mean, after a while, it didn't matter what Margaret said. She said a lot of interesting things. She said a lot of very foolish things. And sometimes she gave the position of being avant-garde when she really wasn't avant-garde.
Margaret Mead visited the Australian National University in 1964. And in November of that year, we had a long private meeting in my study in the Research School of Pacific Studies. I laid before her all of the evidence that I had that indicated that her conclusion was not empirically justified. She was very much taken aback by this and subsequently reported that she felt that her results were now under threat. But when I wrote to her saying that although our conclusions differed, I hoped that there would be no bad feeling between us and that I would strive to see that there was not, she wrote back to me from New York in December 1964 saying, "Anyway, what matters is the work." And I thought that was an exemplary reply.
My mother knew about Freeman, the particular kind of personality he has, the fact that he has sometimes been somewhat unpredictable, and she was worried about it. She was worried that he might behave in a way that would be damaging to anthropology and damaging to the people of Samoa.
You see, when you are dealing with a matter like this, Margaret Mead's conclusion in coming of age in Samoa had become established doctrine in universities throughout America. Now, I well realized that attempting to undo that was a very formidable task indeed, and I had to go about it most thoroughly. And it was only when I had assembled the evidence that I felt by March 1978 that I was in a position to do it. But very soon after that, Margaret Mead unfortunately died. And I then realized that there must be a pause, there must be a decent pause between her death and the publication of the refutation. And I still, at any rate, had to seek certain evidence in Samoa and Honolulu.
In 1981, at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, Freeman completes the evidence for his refutation, and in 1982 he accepts an offer of publication by Harvard University Press. But before the book is released, Edwin McDowell, a journalist from the New York Times, picks up the story.
The next thing I knew was that one morning while I was having a bath here, the telephone rang, and I got up and went to the telephone unclad. Quite naked, and there was Ewan McDowell on the telephone. I'd never